earlier today. I asked Lindsay what she, oh, good, a recording's in progress. They missed that first part. That's probably just as well. I asked her what she thought about the saying. No, I'll get there. That kelp is the new kale. And she didn't think all that much of it, which was the same as what I thought, because I think kelp is way better. Now, nothing wrong with kale, but kelp is the answer. So a couple of housekeeping things here. When you do ask questions, Lindsay will repeat them so the rest of the audience can hear. And you're welcome to ask them as the talk goes on. Afterwards, we will have refreshments, and donations are appreciated. There's a donation box back there. It helps us pay for the cost of the refreshments and also to bring speakers in and treat them to at least a halfway decent time, we think. And thank you so much for being here. I can't tell you how much fun it is to have people like Dr. Gigi here. And Valerie's giving me the high side. What am I doing? Oh, you're right. Because we didn't put the slide up here. We do need to thank Dead Eyes. They're sponsoring the speaker dinners this season, which is truly, truly wonderful. And they're a great place. Please give them your business. But I thank you them for making this a lot of fun. So I'm done. Dr. Lindsay, welcome.
Okay, I'm gonna move. Oh, I have the wrong one. Welcome, everybody. Good evening. My students call me Dr. G, just for the record. But please do, if you have a question as I'm going through, kind of sharing with you tonight some of the benefits and progress of seaweed aquaculture here in Rhode Island, as well as some of the work that I've been a part of, please do raise your hand and ask it at that time, or I'll take questions at the end, whatever you are most comfortable with. Okay, so what I'm going to talk to you tonight about is seaweeds. I love seaweeds. Most people don't love seaweeds. I get it. We need a new name for them. I'll give you some new names as we go along. But they're sort of underappreciated. Not sort of, they are underappreciated. And it's one of the things that sort of drew me to them. I also like to grow things. I like to grow things on land and also the ocean. So this is sort of what led me to my path in seaweed aquaculture. So we're going to talk about why seaweeds. Why do we want to grow them? What does the industry look like on a global scale? We're going to talk about what people use seaweeds for. And spoiler alert, you all are using seaweeds in your everyday lives, and you may or may not know about it. We'll talk about seaweed aquaculture as it currently stands by state in New England. And then we'll talk a little bit about the work that I did in Rhode Island with some oyster farmers on the mainland. And lastly, kelp and seaweeds have been sort of in the news a lot lately, proposed as some solutions to climate change. And so I added a couple slides at the end to sort of show you what the evidence is, where the gaps in knowledge are, what we currently know in terms of that as a potential solution. Okay, so people have been eating seaweeds for a really, really long time. Seaweeds don't have woody-like tissues like we see in trees on land because they don't have to deal with gravity. And so the fossil record for seaweeds is actually not as extensive. They don't preserve as well. So these are probably significant underestimates. But we know from the fossil records that there are pottery pieces, etc., from human beings that have seaweed material in them, going back 1,500 years in Europe and Japan, 2,500 years in China. And in 2008, there was a study published from Chile showing seaweeds were eaten over 14,000 years ago by the humans and human ancestors that lived on that land. Why are seaweeds attractive as a scientist and also as a person inhabiting this planet Earth that is faced with many challenges as we move forward? Number one, they're environmentally sustainable. What do I mean by that in terms of aquaculture? I mean that we don't have to feed them. Okay, we can plant them out in a suitable place and they will grow on their own. Okay, fish we have to feed. Shellfish we don't feed either. They're considered to be environmentally sustainable as well. Oysters, mussels that you see farmed throughout our beautiful state. They can also take out nutrients. So plants, if anybody's a gardeners, anybody gardeners? Okay, we give nutrients to our plants to grow. So the seaweeds that they're plant-like, as a scientist, I can't say they're plants, but you can kind of think of them that way. They're taking nutrients out of the seawater, okay? Why is that a good thing? Because we humans are putting a lot of nutrients into the seawater. And so if we want a way to kind of clean up those nutrients, some of it's going to be carbon dioxide, some of it's going to be nitrogen, phosphorus, etc. We can grow seaweeds. And when we remove them from the water column, we're also removing those nutrients. We refer to that as nutrient extraction. And I'll kind of get back to that in a little bit. And then climate change mitigation, I put a question mark there for some obvious reasons, and we'll touch on that at the very end tonight. I have a picture here for those of you not familiar with what a seaweed is. Okay, a seaweed is something that's big enough to see with your naked eye, and it grows in the ocean. Okay, they come in kind of three groups: the reds, the greens, and the browns. So I have kind of representatives from the different groups there. Kelp is a brown seaweed, and that will be the focus of most of our talk. Okay, so a question for the audience. Raise your hand if you have eaten a sea vegetable. That's what we call it when we eat seaweed directly. Or you have used a product containing seaweed today. What are the products? Just yell them out. Ice cream, yep, has seaweed. What else? Cosmetics. Toothpaste, if you brushed your teeth this morning, that has seaweed. Okay, non-dairy powdered milk. All kinds of things you're encountering all of the time. That's because we have really special compounds that exist in seaweeds that we can use as thickening agents. So Jell-O is a classic example, or pudding. The commercial products that there's instant products, they all have seaweed compounds in them that make them that creamy consistency. Shampoos, toothpaste, as I mentioned, etc. So chances are you have all used something today that contains seaweeds. You just didn't really know about it. Okay, so what are the uses? So when we eat it directly, we eat some miso soup or some sushi, we call that a sea vegetable. That's because it turns out people don't like saying that they ate a weed, okay? It's just a cognitive function of humans. We think of weeds as kind of throwaway things. We don't like to call them seaweeds. So we rebranded them as sea vegetables, kind of take it or leave it. Phycocolloids, those are those compounds, those thickening agents. They come from different types of seaweeds. Most of them are tropical. So those are the things that you see in yogurt, pudding, all kinds of things, food, and also cosmetics, etc. Without kind of going down the whole list here, garden fertilizer. Fun fact, Rhode Island in its founding days, many people relied on agriculture as their form of business. It is written into the state constitution of the state of Rhode Island that the people will have a right to harvest seaweed because they used it as a fertilizer. So that's the reason why I don't need a permit to go down to the shore and collect seaweed for my research. So you do if you're collecting animals, it's a different story. It's in our state constitution. Pharmaceuticals, cosmetics, dissolvable stitches have seaweed-based materials, et cetera, the list goes on. So they're underappreciated in the sense that we actually use them for so many different things. We don't really know that we're using them for those things. They're also really good for us in terms of nutrition. Okay, so globally, seaweed aquaculture is huge. It is a huge business. So in 2018, the production actually dipped a bit from the previous report, but this is from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations called FAO. 32.4 million tons of aquatic plants, and over 99.7% of that is seaweeds. There are some freshwater and phytoplankton aquatic plants that are produced that make up that other amount. So valued at $11 billion, and the main production is coming from China, Indonesia, and it's being used primarily for food and then commercial components, like I mentioned before. The four crops here, these are your big players. So up on the left, this reddish seaweed, this is Gracilaria. Anybody ever taken a microbiology class? Some hands coming up. So you might have grown bacteria in a petri dish on something called agar. That comes from Gracilaria. That is a compound produced by that seaweed. Up there in the top right, that's nori. That's your sushi seaweed. It's actually a red seaweed, though it looks green when it's dried. Down here in the bottom left, that's eucuma. That's where you're getting most of what's called carrageenan. That's in pudding and toothpaste. It's also a red seaweed. I took that picture on a farm in Indonesia. Looks green because it's extremely nutrient deprived. So it reacts to its environment by changing its pigments. And then down in the bottom right, that is my colleague, Agnes Moles Mortensen. She farms seaweed on the Faroe Islands in the Atlantic, and she's holding kelp. So kelp is the biggest crop globally by weight because it's huge. Some places they are farming giant kelp, which is what you think of when you think of like a kelp forest. So these dynamic three-dimensional habitats. Most kelp that's being farmed in the world looks like what she's holding. And that's like the species we have here, which is called sugar kelp. Okay, it grows to that length in 3 to 6 months over the winter, and we eat it. That's what's in your miso soup and other products that you are familiar with. Okay, kelp aquaculture in New England was sort of in fits and starts over the past several decades. There have been different attempts to sort of establish a commercial aquaculture sector that had varying degrees of success, but they always kind of came back down. In 2009, as we will see, the first commercial kelp farm was established in Maine, and that was the first in the United States. And since then, it has just gone up and up and up. Now, it took some time, and we have a long way to go, as you'll see, but it continues to build momentum. So primarily the sugar kelp, which if you're interested in scientific names, Saccharina latissima. This is a native species. All kelps are cold water species. Okay, so the southern limit of sugar kelp on the eastern coast of the United States is Long Island Sound. Some of that has to do with temperature, and a lot of that has to do with the glaciers. Long Island Sound was the last extent, the southern extent of the glaciers, and below that, we don't have a lot of rocks for kelp to grow on, and kelp likes rocks. So A, it's too hot, and B, there's not a lot of what we call substrate or rocks to live south of Long Island. It's extractive because it's taking nutrients out of the water. It has, I write low maintenance and capital costs. That's relative to, right? So like, it's not easy. It is a lot of work. There are people in this room that will attest to that. But relative to farming other species like shellfish or fish, it has lower amounts of equipment and time that you have to invest in. And it's, of course, nutritious, really high in iodine. And it has sort of the profile of any type of vegetable that you would see on land. It's also easy to produce, and this is also one of those relative to. Okay, seaweeds have very complex life cycles. Kelp is one that we've kind of nailed it down. We can do it pretty easily in the lab. And so this is a picture. This is publicly available if you are curious about how to grow things. The New England Seaweed Culture Handbook. This is something I co-wrote with Sarah Redman, who you'll see again later, when we were doing our graduate work. And it basically tells you how do you grow teeny tiny plants in the lab to then go put out on a farm. Okay, yes. It is a perennial in the wild, so somewhere between 3 and 10 years per what we call frond or thalli. In aquaculture, we don't grow it for more than 1 year. Are you talking about an aquaculture or like people that wild harvest natural populations? So in aquaculture, we harvest the entire thing at the end of sort of the growing season, which is mostly tied to temperature. So we grow it in the winter here because in the summer, what happens is it dies back a little bit. Lots of stuff starts to grow on it. So you want to pull it out before any of that happens. So you do about 6 months and everything comes out. But in nature, it goes for many, many years. Yep. Okay, so why kelp? Kind of all the reasons that I've already brought up. And George said, kelp, it's the new kale. I have an exclamation point, but I don't like kale. So I don't like this comparison. But I think that what it's trying to get at is it got a little bit trendy. It's also pretty mild from a culinary point of view. You can incorporate it into a lot of dishes. And it got a lot of attention, and it still is getting a lot of attention. So there were stories in the New York Times. There was a CBS News story on 60 Minutes about kelp aquaculture. There have been podcasts about seaweeds. So it kind of, we got to this moment where it finally seemed like we're really gaining steam and we might actually have something here. We're way behind the rest of the world in a lot of ways, but the market kind of drives the ability of people to do this for a living, right? So like if you are a business person, if you're a farmer and you want to grow kelp because it's beautiful and wonderful, like that's awesome. But at the end of the day, you got to make some money. And so the market is sort of not quite caught up in a lot of ways, and we'll sort of see the bottlenecks that occur. And that's sort of what's holding it back right now. Okay, so we're going to start our journey in Maine because that's where kelp started its journey. I mentioned before in 2009, the first commercial seaweed farm was established. Its name at that time was Ocean Approved. It was established by two gentlemen. One was a businessman and one was a chef. They originally were mussel farmers, and they kind of fell into loving seaweed, started growing seaweed on their mussel farm. Then they sold off their mussel farm and went full bore. It has now been rebranded as Atlantic Sea Farms, and Brianna Warner is their president and CEO. And so the model that they have is that they will teach anyone to grow kelp. And then that's kind of where the education ends, because it's what happens to the kelp when it comes out of the water and how they market it that's proprietary. So they work with farmers throughout the state of Maine. I think they have about it's between 30 and 100. It's kind of hard to pin down. Farmers that are growing at various scales. A lot of these folks are either lobstermen that are doing this in the winter months, or they're farming shellfish and they're kind of adding kelp to their crops. And they're growing the kelp and they basically give it to them, right? So they grow it, it comes out of the water, it goes to Atlantic Sea Farms, which has a commercial facility in Portland. And that's where it is made into their products. Originally, their main product was sort of a noodle substitute, is flash frozen. I don't actually know if they're doing that anymore, but they've come out with a whole line of sort of fermented kimchi-like products, etc. So that's kind of where the magic happens. And they're sold in Whole Foods and lots of big commercial places throughout the Northeast and kind of expanding throughout the coast or throughout the country. So very successful model. What is the production of seaweeds in Maine? So this is a graph from the Department of Marine Resources in Maine. It's kind of hard to see. It starts at 2015. It goes to 2021. And so what you can see really clearly is low, getting higher, boom, huge amount. So this is where we're seeing, okay, the momentum behind kelp aquaculture is really starting to stick. And we're really starting to get people interested in it. They're producing over 500,000 pounds now of kelp in Maine every year. Now, the water in Maine is colder than the water in southern New England, so they have a much longer growing season than we do. Generally, their kelp grows a lot bigger than ours does because of that, okay? That doesn't mean that we can't grow it here too. Springtide seaweed. So this is Sarah Redman, who I mentioned I worked with in grad school. She wrote the manual on kelp aquaculture. She now has her own seaweed aquaculture farm, and that's her there. She actually does a lot of different species, which is cool, in Maine. So she's doing sugar kelp, but also some other species of kelp. Dulse, if anybody's ever heard of that, it's a red seaweed. And developing some other techniques for nori and some of the species that are a little bit harder to grow. And they grow fresh and dried products. They also work to try to solve some of the bottleneck issues that I'll talk about a little later in the industry and help other farmers get established. Okay, moving to my home state. I'm from the White Mountains of New Hampshire. There are 5 commercial farms. So the numbers that I'm presenting to you today, these are farms that are permitted. That doesn't mean that they're necessarily growing kelp. So that's a little bit harder to determine. But there are 5 commercial farms that are permitted to grow kelp in the state of New Hampshire. Yes, we do have 17 miles of coastline, in case you're wondering. Michael Chambers at the University of New Hampshire does a lot of integrated multi-trophic aquaculture. That's when we're growing multiple species together. So he does sea bass with mussels and kelp. I did my PhD in Chris Neefus's lab, and he's at the University of New Hampshire, also working on nori aquaculture. And so these are some pictures from the work that I did there, trying to develop 2 of our species for aquaculture production. All right, a bit south in Massachusetts. Massachusetts had 5 permitted farms in 2021, and they produced almost 10,000 pounds of seaweed. That's not too bad. I think most of the farms were either integrated, so they were shellfish farms that added kelp, or experimental farms. But the first full-scale kelp farm opened, I think it's Chatham Kelp on Cape Cod. And at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, which is also on Cape Cod in Woods Hole, Scott Lindell and his research group. Scott Lindell is an expert on on shellfish aquaculture, but he's kind of transitioned into the seaweed world. And he's doing a project now looking at sort of crossbreeding kelp varieties that would be resilient to warming temperatures, because I mentioned before, they are cold water species. So we are rapidly watching them sort of migrate north as seawater temperatures continue to rise. So if we want a long-term industry in southern New England, we have to kind of figure out, are there natural strains that are tolerant to warmer temperatures, etc. Okay, I'm skipping Rhode Island for a very important reason, because I'm going to highlight what we did in Rhode Island, and going right to Connecticut, where a lot of work is happening. They have 15 permitted farms, and Yukon has been a leader in seaweed aquaculture for decades, led by, he's now an emeritus, which means he's retired finally, Professor Charlie Yarish, who is world renowned, and his research associate, Simona Ayugate, who now works at a commercial aquaculture farm in Hawaii, and Jung Kim, who has worked in Korea, among other places. And they grow both commercially. They're the only state that's permitted to grow gracilaria, which is that red seaweed that produces agar. And they grow sugar kelp. And so there are a variety of farms that have kind of popped up throughout Connecticut. Another fun fact, both Maine and Connecticut have Sea Grant. Every state has a Sea Grant office. Sea Grant is basically there to help farmers or people that are doing marine research. They have an extension office. So if you've ever gone to your extension office for agriculture, land-based agriculture, you're like, oh, I have a pest in my garden, help me, or whatever. They have a sea-based extension office, and both Maine and Connecticut have a seaweed extension officer. So a person full-time dedicated to seaweed aquaculture in those states. So Anushka Concepcion is the Connecticut Sea Grant seaweed officer. Jacqueline Robideau is the one in Maine. So it is their job to help people farm seaweed, which is awesome. Also in Connecticut is the home of Green Wave, which is a nonprofit organization. They're really the only commercial scale hatchery. So that's where farmers can go to get baby kelp to put on their farm in New England. They recently, well, I'll amend it. They're basically the biggest one. They're the only one in southern New England. There are a couple in Maine. Recently, Anushka published, like 2 weeks ago, a nursery list for the United States. So we're trying to kind of get this information out there where people can actually go and get seed supplies. It's pretty bare bones at this point. So that's kind of one of the bottlenecks, being able to find seed supply. But the hope is sort of as the industry grows, there'll be more of those businesses coming online. Okay, going back to our state of Rhode Island. So seaweed aquaculture in Rhode Island was initially tried by Jules Upton Himmel of walrus and carpenter oysters. And this is a picture. He actually established a hatchery. He doesn't do it anymore, but he did for a couple of years, where this is what a baby kelp spool looks like. It is highly sophisticated. It's a PVC spool that you buy at Home Depot. You cut it to the length that you want it, and you wrap string around it. The string has to have a special makeup. I was being sarcastic when I said so, just kidding. So you wrap the spool up, and then you seed the baby kelp onto it. You'll see how it goes out onto the farm. When Jules grew kelp, he had a partnership with Foolproof, I think, was the brewing company, where they actually made a beer that incorporated his sugar kelp, which was kind of cool. And that was on the market for a couple of years. After that, I came to the state of Rhode Island in 2014. And I kind of took a hiatus from seaweed aquaculture and started working on some other questions related to seaweed. And then I decided, I kind of miss it, because that's what I did my PhD work on. So I decided to kind of come back to it, and I'm going to share with you guys sort of the results of some work that we did from 2017, 2016, 2017, up to 2019 with oyster farmers in Rhode Island, where we actually grew sugar kelp on their farms. As of today, or as of 2020, when the last report that incorporated kelp came out from the CRMC, there were 10 permitted farms. I think there's somewhere between 3 and 5 people that are actually actively growing kelp. Not all of those farms are actively growing kelp in Rhode Island. And I was originally approached by oyster farmers who had kind of heard about the craze of kelp and thought like, hey, maybe this could be something that I do in the winter, right? Oysters grow year round on farms, but they go into sort of a dormancy in the winter months. And so you don't handle them as much. It's actually not good to necessarily. So of course you're still on your farm, you're still harvesting. Of course, you're still tending to your things, but you're not dealing with as much as in the summer when it's crazy and they're growing really fast and you have to sort them, etc. So you kind of have a little bit more time in the winter months, which seemed like a perfect fit for something like kelp aquaculture that grows in the winter. Okay. So originally we were approached by some oyster farmers and they sort of said, do you think I could grow kelp on my farm? And I was like, I don't know, probably, maybe. We didn't really have the information to tell them an accurate answer to that. And so what we did is we went out and we got some research funding to pay for us to kind of answer some of these questions. And what we're really interested in understanding was, okay, what types of places can we grow kelp? And how soon should it go in the water for you to get the best production? Because the money you get is all based on the weight. So the bigger the kelp, the more weight, the more money at the end of the season. So those are some of the questions we went into this project with. We partnered with Cindy and John West at Moonstone Oysters. Their sites are actually in a salt pond. And so up to this point, there had been nothing published in the scientific literature and nothing to my knowledge where anybody had grown kelp in a salt pond. These are shallow, low wave energy environments. Generally, aquaculture farms for kelp are sort of like medium. You want to have decent flow because it affects their morphology and they're deeper. So we generally talking about 25 feet deep. You put the kelp down about 6 feet from the surface, and that's for both sunlight and also boating reasons. And so we thought, okay, her farms are somewhere between like 2 and 3 meters, which is like 6 and 10 feet deep at low tide. Maybe we can grow it there. Who knows? So we thought we would try. So what we were interested in discovering here, our other partners were in Wickford and in Rome Point, and this was Russ Blank and his nephew, Tom. So we grew on 2 of their farms, which are called Narragansett Bay North and South. So that's the West Passage, Narragansett Bay. Right in the middle there, that's Jamestown, and then Newport, my home, where Salve is, over on the right. And then Point Judas, you can see it's between Narragansett and Wickford. Narragansett and Wakefield in South County. So very close to one another the sites were, but a little bit different in how they grow their oysters. So these are the questions that I'm going to answer for you. Does time of planting matter? And can we grow kelp in salt ponds? So how do we do this? How do we grow kelp? Well, we set up our own nursery at the University of Rhode Island, where I was working at the time. And so these are some pictures, and I'm going to show you a video in just a second of how we plant it, but this is from sort of the first season. I'm going to walk away for a second. So we grow them on these PVC spools in the lab. I'm going to show you in a minute. We have to actually go out and scuba dive and find reproductive kelp to get our seed spools, to get gametes onto our seed spools. We grow them for somewhere between 6 and 8 weeks. That's it in the lab, but everything has to be maintained sterile. There's temperature requirements, there's light requirements, etc. And then about 8 weeks later, they look like this. And so there's sort of these fuzzy strings. They might be smaller than this when you put them out, and that's fine. They're pretty rugged. And so we grow them on this little twine because, as you can see, what we do on the farm is we wrap that twine around a really thick rope. And so that's how it's planted out on the farm. And as it grows, it has this sort of little hand that develops at the end. In nature, that hand hangs onto a rock. But on an aquaculture farm, it's going to go around that rope and hang on. And so it kind of anchors it together with the other blades that are there. This is just an array that we use to monitor the conditions at the farm, so temperature, nutrients, etc. Kelp is kind of cool because it has this little stem here that's called a stipe. And then this is the blade part. And it actually grows from this little point where they meet. And so this is a hole punch that I took from my desk. And I can punch a hole in it. I can actually measure how far it moves. And you can measure the elongation the length that way. And this is a picture from our Rome Point farm. So these blades were over 9 feet long when we harvested them that first year. A lot of that had to do with how early we were able to plant. So some more specifics about the nursery. There's me with a giant piece of kelp. So we have to go out scuba diving, and usually you're sort of at the whims of when the natural population is reproducing. Okay, so one year we were able to get reproductive kelp in August, which is unusual, but awesome because it meant we could plant our kelp plants on the farms earlier. Most years you're talking about like October. And so you kind of have to do the math. Okay, if I collect in October, I got to wait like 8 weeks to be able to put it out on the farm because that's how long it takes for the nursery production to happen. So we come into the lab and a reproductive kelp is easily recognized because it has this really dark stripe down the middle. It looks almost like a chocolate stripe and it's actually bumpy. It's like raised up. That is the reproductive tissue. We call it sorus. And so it turns out with almost every seaweed that if you stress them out to the brink of death, they release their spores, right? It makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. They think they're goners, they want to reproduce. So what we do is we bring them into the lab, we clean it off really well to try to get everything else off of it, put it in the fridge overnight, and they're like, whoa, what's going on here? Resubmerge it in water the next day, and you can see it's on ice because kelp likes cold water. I actually also play wave noises because I find that helps. And what you see is you can kind of, I'm serious, I actually do that. What you can see is it's starting to turn like a little bit beigey in the water. Those are billions and billions and billions of spores that are swimming around and they're looking for a home. And so we count those under a microscope and we know from previous studies sort of what the concentration should be. We dilute it down and we pour those into another PVC container that contains just a single spool, a single one of those spools that you see in that aquaria. And we leave it in the fridge for a day. And at the end of that day, those spores, which are going to grow into male and female, they are attached to the string. And so what happens next is we manipulate temperature, we manipulate light, and the male and female actually reproduce on the string. And the blade that we want actually grows out of the female. And so we can manipulate, that all happens in about 2 weeks. It happens really fast. And then you start to see the baby kelp grow. Then you just need them to grow big enough for them to go out to the farm. The bigger they are, the kind of better it is in the sense that they'll be a little bit more hardy when you plant them out, but they're also starting to compete with each other if you're in an aquaria. So it's kind of a balancing act when you get them out there. Okay, so you can see this is sort of like the beginning stages of what a spool starts to look like after that male and female have reproduced on the string. They're microscopic. You can't see any of that happen. And then those are really probably 8 weeks later, I would say. And you can see the bubbles here. So the bubbles, that's CO2, that's oxygen being produced by photosynthesis. So they're cranking and they grow really fast. That's kind of what's magical about kelp. And okay. So I'm just going to switch here for a moment to PowerPoint because I want to show you this video. Oh yeah, sorry, I'm going to use the mouse. Here. So this is how we outplant them. So when I was explaining before, we kind of wrap the string. I'm hanging onto this spool with pliers, and we are basically backing a boat up. So certain conditions are required for you to do this. You cannot plant seed when it's super, super windy. You kind of need flat, calm conditions. You can see it's pretty calm where we are on that farm. And you just back it up. You don't want to pull it super tight because it'll break. That's happened before. That sucks. But if you leave it really loose, then it's going to sag. So there's sort of like a little bit of a technique to how strong, how tight it is when you put it out. Okay, I'm going back over to the PDF. I'll show you one more video in a second. Okay. Good. Okay, those were just screenshots in case the video didn't work. That's me planting kelp with Cindy West. and my collaborator, Austin Humphreys from the University of Rhode Island. And then you monitor it. So once it's out there, what you're really looking for is it growing? Did my line break? Do I need to add any buoys? Those are the big questions when you're going out and monitoring your kelp. If it's in a place where the conditions are right, it's going to do its thing and it will grow on its own and it will be very happy. And you don't have to interfere with it really at all. And do other things grow on your line? They sure do, but kelp grows so fast that it outcompetes it. And so we kind of know how to seed it in such a way that that kind of gets eliminated. Also, the fact that we've planted in winter, there's not a lot of stuff growing in winter. So it gives it that advantage. So we monitor the growth. We looked at both kelp and oysters in this study, but I'm only going to talk about kelp. Water samples. So it's important for them to have adequate nutrients. So if you have a site that's nutrient deprived, it's probably not great for kelp. And then also looking sort of at how much nutrients are they actually removing from the water column with their tissue. Okay, so this is sort of the design, because remember, we're dealing with oyster farms. So these farms are already established, and at 3 of the sites, 3 out of 4, we had bottom rack cultures. So these are big stacked racks of oysters with bags in them on the bottom, and then we put the long line over top of them. Okay, so the kelp is submerged below the surface because, believe it or not, too much light at the surface, they don't do well. In nature, they're living pretty deep in the water column, so we got to put them a little bit down. It also lessens the chances somebody's going to run over your line, which is important. So we put them 1 to 2 meters down with sort of buoy dropper systems and then big moorings on either end, because they get big and they have a lot of drag once they get big. So you need to make sure you have really big anchors on the ends to make sure you're not pulling them. One of our sites, we had oysters that were bottom culture also, but they weren't caged. So they're actually just spread out on the bottom, and you would dredge them up when you wanted to harvest them. So that was the 4th site, and we just put them over the top of that site. So they probably weren't as concentrated in terms of the oysters at that site. Okay, this is the second video. So this is the last time I'm going to flip over here. But this is the view of one of the kelp lines. As I have it on the boat, and then I'm letting it go. And you're watching it come back down into the water column. So it's being pushed back down to the proper depth by the buoys. But you can see this is pretty big kelp. This is probably 6, 7 feet long at this point in the season. This is pretty close to harvest at the site I just mentioned. This is in Point Judith Pond. So this site is only 9 feet deep at low tide, and we've already put the kelp down 3 feet. So it's got 6 feet, and you can tell if you look closely that it's dragging on the bottom by, you see sort of at the tips, it looks silty. The kelp is so big, it's dragging on the bottom during sort of low tide. But we answered one question, right? Can you grow it in a salt pond? Yes, you can. You can grow a lot of it in a salt pond. Yep. Well, it's not getting any longer than that because it breaks off. So that tip piece is the oldest part of the frond. And so kelp actually naturally kind of get rid of that tissue in the summer months. So when it's dragging, it's basically friction is coming off. It's good in the sense that it keeps stuff from growing on it, but it definitely caps the length at which you can go. You're not getting any more than that at your site, certainly. Of course. Yep. It's a great question. So, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't repeat the other questions. Thanks for calling me out. No, that's important. The question was, the pH of soil is important if you're growing land plants. Is the pH of the water important when you're growing kelp? So pH of water, we know, is going down, something called ocean acidification. Turns out, and we're actually going to talk about this in a little bit, seaweeds don't actually care very much about pH unless they have a shell, because there are seaweeds that are shelled, which sounds funny, but it's true. Kelp is not one of them. kelp actually naturally drives the pH of water up. So seaweeds, when they photosynthesize, because they're taking CO2 out of the water column during photosynthesis, during the day, you see pH comes up. At night, when they're not photosynthesizing, it comes back down. It's a natural cycle we see in our coastal waters. So they have been proposed as a solution to ocean acidification because they naturally drive it up. So we'll see that make a appearance again in a little bit. So the oysters are producing the nutrients that the kelp are extracting. But remember, I said that oysters are sort of dormant in the winter. Okay, so oysters are filter feeders. They're filtering out of the water column. They're really looking for like little bits of organic matter or phytoplankton, which are microscopic algae. And then they're, of course, exuding some sort of nitrogenous waste like all animals do. Kelp is really only taking up things that are dissolved in the water. So they can't really take up any bits, but they do compete with phytoplankton, the food of oysters, for light and nutrients. So in some studies that have recently been published out of Europe, these are actually mussels, but the shellfish actually benefit the kelp more than vice versa because they're eliminating their competitor, if that makes sense. It's not totally clear in our context, and I mean Southern New England, how much of an interaction there are between oysters and kelp, because oysters aren't really growing that much during the winter. So they're kind of like chilling, making sure that they can survive those cold months. And so we probably have some interaction like on the beginning of the kelp season and at the very end when the water starts to warm up. But nobody's really quantified that yet. Great questions. Okay, so that was some screenshots of the video just to highlight if I wasn't able to play it. Okay, so this is the kelp harvest that we had in 2018. This is an article titled Seaweed Savior, which I will gladly take that title in Rhode Island Monthly. And so this is at Cindy West's farm, and it's a lot of hard work to harvest kelp. So it's really heavy. You're dealing with a huge amount of it. And if you want to sell it as a food product, it has to be kept at proper temperatures really quickly. And so this is one of the challenges that the industry is facing. Like, how do we deal with this massive amount of biomass that's all kind of coming out at the same time out of the ocean? Are we going to dry it? Are we going to cook it? Where are we going to do that? How? Those are questions that are sort of plaguing the industry still. I'm going to show you some graphs, but I don't want you to get overwhelmed by the data here. These are pretty simple take-home stories. This is the length of the kelp in year 1 and year 2, because we did this in 2 years. In the first year, we were able to plant it much earlier. Okay, we planted it right November 1st. In Rhode Island, the DEM says you can grow kelp from November 1st to April 30th. Okay, so you have that 6-month window. Many times people can't plant until later because seed supply, right? If we collect reproductive kelp in October, we got to wait 8 weeks till we can plant. So this one we planted much later, somewhere in December, January. So the take home here is if you plant it earlier, it grows a whole lot more, which this is kind of intuitive, but this is data that we have to kind of back up that claim. The earlier it gets in the water, the more it's going to grow. Now, the one important caveat here is that the water needs to be below 15 degrees centigrade, which is 60 degrees Fahrenheit. So the time that happens fluctuates from year to year. Kelp does not like temperatures above that. I don't know if they're coming for you like that, but yeah, George. Oh, I'm sorry. The question was, why would the DEM want to arrest you if you're growing it outside of that window? And so I don't know if they would come for people like that, but I think the rationale was, okay, we're doing a sort of winter crop. It's not a big industry here. We want to give people space to experiment, but we are the ocean state. We get a lot of people using the water in the summer. We don't want that to interfere. So we're kind of setting up these regulations. It's sort of my understanding that as kelp farming grows, that there might be some negotiations that happen regarding the timing of it. But I guess initially they thought like this isn't an established thing yet. So like we'll give you this window, but we're not really willing to go into those other conflicts unless it becomes an industry, if that makes sense. That's my understanding of it. This is the yield. So this is the kilograms, because we do everything in metric in science instead of in the typical units, that we grew per meter of longline. So per meter of that big string, how much kelp did we grow? And so these are different sites that you see. The lighter colors on the left are the sites that are in Narragansett Bay. Those are traditional sites that people would grow kelp at. And then the darker colors are in the salt pond. And so you can see, the top is year 1 and the bottom is year 2. You can see a couple things that I want to point out here. Number 1, we grew a lot of kelp in the salt pond. So we were able to grow almost as much kelp as in what people would consider a traditional site. So this is really important because a lot of our oyster aquaculture happens in salt ponds. So if those folks are interested in growing kelp, this is a proof of concept that it might be possible for them to do that on their farm. The other thing is there's a whole lot of changes, right? Like year 1, the top row, and year 2 do not look the same. Okay, so some of that has to do with when we planted it. Some of it has to do with the fact that we're collecting wild reproductive materials, so the genetics might vary from year to year. And some of it just has to do with there's natural variation out there. And so the crop consistency is not there yet. A lot of farmers, land farmers, if you're familiar, they want to have a consistent uniform crop. And so if that's something we're going to rely on with seaweeds, that has been achieved in other places where they have extensive breeding programs like China, Japan, and Korea, but we're not there yet. So that might be a challenge moving forward. And this last graph is nutrient extraction. So how much nitrogen and how much carbon are these taking out of the water? And so again, in the top, it's year 1, on the bottom, year 2, and then the sites are color-coded the same. So you can see here that we have, at the top is nitrogen. Reorient you here. Top is nitrogen. So nitrogen is the number 1 pollution in the ocean, okay? So it is the limiting nutrient in the ocean, number 1. So all primary production in the ocean is limited by nitrogen, though some cases iron and phosphorus come into play. But it's also what we put on our lawns and in our gardens. So when it rains, all of that water leads to the ocean, no matter where you live, inland, on the coast, it all makes its way there eventually. And it comes with a whole lot of nitrogen. And so nitrogen is what we call that eutrophication. We have a big problem with excess nitrogen in our coasts. So that's why we're measuring that. Carbon, of course, related to carbon dioxide in our atmosphere, which causes greenhouse gases, which causes global warming. So you can see that we have a pretty high amount of nitrogen and carbon removal. And this has been known for a long time, but it's important to quantify. And these numbers are very similar to what we see on farms in other places in southern New England, a little bit lower than what we see in Maine. And a lot of that has to do with the biomass in Maine is higher at harvest. They have a couple other species that are they grow a little faster than this one, but they also have a much longer growing season. So they just get a higher biomass. So in terms of biomass production, we're probably always going to be a bit lower in southern New England because of our truncated season, just from water temperature, not necessarily from DEM, because other states have longer growing windows than we do in Rhode Island. But we can still contribute quite a lot to this sort of coastal pollution of nitrogen, and to a lesser extent, carbon. Okay, so take-home messages, just to reiterate, plant as early as possible. Shallow sites like salt ponds can be highly productive. Our harvested biomasses were similar to others in the region, but lower than what we get in the Gulf of Maine. And things are highly variable. So within a site, within years, between years, there's a lot of variation. And so if we want that to kind of smooth out, we have some work to do in terms of domesticating these crops. Okay, so persistent bottlenecks. So I kind of mentioned these as I went, but there is sort of a lack of high quality seed spools because that nursery Green Wave, at least in southern New England, they're the only ones that do southern New England spores. So folks are often restricted by the amount of seed they can get from them, the crop variability, and then really profitability is huge. So the profitability and the harvesting. So it's very much linked to our capacity to deal with this huge influx of biomass coming from coastal waters at the same time every year from everyone, right? Because they all has to come out in that kind of spring window. And sort of the production of what we call value-added products. So you can use kelp for fertilizer, but you will make a lot more money if you can sell it as a human food product. And then how do people want to eat kelp? Do you need to make it into a relish? Do you need to dry it? So it's sort of those issues and sort of dealing with the market part of it that are continued bottlenecks in the industry. Now I focused on New England, but seaweed aquaculture on the West Coast has blown up. So they were after us in terms of timing, but Alaska now produces more than Maine. And there's huge production in also Washington State and California. I haven't heard of anything in Oregon, though I'm sure it's close behind. Okay, so just really quickly, I wanted to address a couple things. And so I kind of talked about this before, but this is sort of the concept that we might be able to grow kelp to lessen the impacts of ocean acidification for shellfish on a farm. Okay, so it would be shellfish you're a shellfish farmer, you can grow some kelp, it's gonna help your shellfish deal with ocean acidification. Basically the take-home message here is we are not convinced that can happen. Okay, it's highly context specific. So in the state of Washington, they did a 5-year study, a huge 5-year study, where they put out the most sophisticated scientific equipment we had. No change in pH with kelp. However, in China, this study actually looked at 3 different seaweeds. They saw a pretty considerable change in pH. It all has to do with how much your water flows, right? Are the currents fast? Does the water exchange a lot? What are the certain circumstances of your farm? Also, if you harvest the seaweed, that's it, right? So if you only grow kelp for 6 months, then you only have an influence for 6 months. So it would have to be sort of a year-round operation if you wanted to have a big impact. Along that lines, what happens at night? So kelp is raising the pH during the day, but it goes down at night. So some studies from Maine have actually indicated that it stays up. It might stay a little elevated at night near kelp farms. But again, when you harvest it, there's sort of an issue. So this is sort of an open question. Is it possible? Sure. Have we figured it out all the way? No, we have not. So it's not sort of a silver bullet in our fight against ocean acidification as a shellfish farming community. The other thing that is sold a lot with kelp, or has been talked about tremendously, there's a lot of debate in the scientific community about this, is can we farm so much seaweed in the ocean, because the ocean is big, that we actually reduce the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? Can this be a strategy to mitigate carbon dioxide pollution and help prevent sort of the thresholds that we have been talking about, this 1.5 C or 2 C threshold of warming from global warming? And this is another one where it sounds great in principle, but there are a lot of challenges to us getting there. Number one, the area you would have to farm is enormous. And the open ocean, some of you may know this, is nutrient deficient. Okay, there's not a lot of photosynthesis that happens in the middle of the ocean because it has an issue with iron. They're called high nitrogen, low chlorophyll areas. So you can't do this on the coastline because it would interfere too much with human uses of coastline because we don't have enough space. So if you go to the open ocean, like how do you build something that can deal with being out in the open ocean? How do you build it at such a big scale? And then also these seaweeds, they don't grow for 200 years like a redwood does. They turn over in half a decade or more. So what happens to the carbon when they turn over? Does it end up in the deep sea? We don't really know. Does it end up getting released and taken up by something else? Maybe, probably. So there's a lot of unanswered questions here, but I think that the take home from all of the sort of climate hero talk is it part of the solution? Absolutely. Is it a silver bullet? No, right? So this has to be a multifaceted approach. Can it make a difference? Surely. Is it good for us? Yes. But are we going to solve climate change by farming the ocean with seaweed? Probably not, right? So we have to take a multifaceted approach. Oh, and this is actually a screenshot from an article I read not that long ago, where this is a company that I just learned about. They're a venture capital company out of Maine, and their idea is to grow kelp in the open ocean and then sink it into the deep sea as a long-term carbon storage strategy. But we actually don't know what would happen. And so like there's been a lot of the scientists have kind of been fleeing away from that, and there's a lot of controversy around it currently, but they haven't actually successfully grown any kelp in the open ocean quite yet. So future problem. Okay, and lastly, I wanted to plug that if you guys don't know about it, you have your very own kelp company on Block Island. So Catherine, standing in the back, Block Island shellfish and Block Island kelp. Okay, so if you want to try some seaweeds, if you're feeling adventurous, if you already know you love kelp, in the springtime, when the harvest comes, look up Catherine and support your local aquaculture community. She's been really successful growing beautiful seaweed here in Great Salt Pond, and would really like to continue to do it. So we just need to kind of get buy-in and have a place for everybody to enjoy that kelp on the island itself. So please keep that in mind. April, May, every year. Okay, so overall summary before I stop talking. Seaweeds are nutritious, environmentally friendly crops. Seaweed aquaculture is growing, but we have bottlenecks that persist, challenges that really every industry that's sort of starting to take off has to deal with. Seaweeds provide environmental benefits and should be part of our future mitigation efforts, but are not a silver bullet. Restoration and preservation of native seaweed habitats, so places like kelp forests that grow on their own, they actually take up a lot more carbon than a seaweed farm can, and they persist for many years. So that's another important part of the strategy. And then US production is rapidly increasing both on the East Coast and the West Coast. So we are a drop in the bucket in terms of the global aquaculture scene. Okay, so I would just like to quickly acknowledge my dog. This is my dog, Lily, who has come out. You can see her at the dock doing some kelp and oyster experiments with me. My collaborators, a whole host of them. It really does take a village. Our industry partners, which we could not have done any of this work without. Undergrad researchers, funding from NOAA, of course. And I'm happy to stick around and answer any questions. My contact info is at the bottom there. So if you tweet on Twitter, I tweet all things seaweed at Hope and Seaweed, my lab website, and then also my email if you ever have any questions after today. So thank you all for coming, and please ask away.
Thank you, Lindsay, so much. Stick around, have some refreshments. Lindsay will be here for a bit if you think of some more questions, and socialize and talk about seaweed or not. Thank you.